The Alpha King's son was standing in the doorway, staring at what she had pulled from under the floor. And Sable could see from his face that everything he had been told about himself for 23 years had just become a lie. Tomorrow morning, they were going to exile him for something that was never true. Sable knew this because 43 days ago, she found a box under a dead man's floor. Inside it was a document that explained everything: a blood work report, a compound listing, and a registry stamp that told her exactly who had been adjusting the dosage every quarter for 23 years. Not a curse, not a defect, not the moon goddess withholding her blessing from an unworthy heir. A recipe, administered via water ration, reviewed quarterly, and he paid for from the royal treasury without a single missed payment in 23 years. The physician who sealed it under his floor was Elder Holt. Elder Holt had been dead for 3 weeks after he sealed it. Sable had spent 43 days being too afraid to speak. She had watched Rowan Ashvale train alone in the frost yard every morning because the pack's wolves couldn't feel him. She had watched his father look away from him in the great hall. She had watched 300 wolves stand in silence this morning while Lord Veyron announced the exile in the smooth, ceremonial voice of a man who had been building toward this moment for 2 decades. Then she had pressed her hand flat against her apron and walked toward his door. Now he was standing in the doorway, looking at what she had found. And the expression on his face was the most devastating thing she had ever seen. Not anger, not disbelief, but the particular look of a person who has just understood that the cage they spent their entire life trying to prove they deserved to be free from was never locked by fate. It was locked by a man who still had the key. Rowan read the document 3 times. He stood in the doorway of his chamber on the night before his exile and read a blood work report dated the week of his birth and did not move for a long time. His weight at birth was listed at the top, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, a detail so specific and so utterly irrelevant to everything that it hit him somewhere unguarded. Someone had written that down, had recorded the weight of the thing they were about to destroy, and filed it neatly alongside the destruction. Ashvale Bond Flux Inhibitor, administered via the air quarters water ration. Dosage, 3 milliliters, reviewed and adjusted quarterly by registry order. Authorization, Office of Lord Veyron, Master of the Royal Registry. The attached invoice showed 23 years of quarterly payments from the Royal Treasury to Doran's Compound House, Apothecary. Operating license registered to Greyvale Keep, Eastern Service Wing. The most recent payment was 11 days ago. The apothecary was still in the palace. The dosage had been adjusted 11 days ago. Rowan looked up from the document. Sable was still standing in the corridor, watching him the way people watch something they have been carrying alone for a long time and have finally set down in front of another person with the particular exhausted relief of shared weight. "How long?" he said. 43 days. "Why didn't you come sooner?" She looked at him directly. "Because the physician who sealed this under his floor was Elder Holt, and Elder Holt was dead 3 weeks after he sealed it." The corridor was very quiet. There is something that happens to a person when they discover that the thing they spent their entire life believing was their own failure was actually someone else's decision. It doesn't feel like relief. Not immediately. It feels like the floor is moving. Like the specific vertigo of realizing that every conclusion you drew about yourself, every accommodation you made, every quiet acceptance of your own inadequacy, was built on information that was never true. 23 years of a story that someone else wrote and handed to you and watched you live inside. Rowan folded the document carefully, the way you fold something you intend to use. "The apothecary," he said. "Do you know which corridor?" "I clean those corridors," Sable said. "I know which ones aren't watched and when." He stepped back from the doorway. 5 minutes. Doran's compound house occupied a small licensed room built into the keep's eastern wall. Registered, operating, hiding in plain sight for 23 years. When they reached it, the door was unlocked. A single candle burned on the workbench. Sitting beside it in the shadows was Elder Thresh. 70 years old, half-blind, retired palace scribe, waiting with the patience of a man who has been holding something for 19 years and had simply decided tonight was the night he put it down. "I knew someone would come eventually," Thresh said. "Sit down." He had been the junior scribe assigned to Veyron's office the year Rowan was born, had processed the original registry order himself, had been told it was temporary, that Rowan's bond frequency was dangerously unstable at birth, that the suppression was a safety measure. He had believed that for 4 years. Then he found the succession amendment buried in the registry archive language, so technical, so deliberately dry, that it had sat undiscovered for nearly 2 decades. A bondless heir meant the throne transferred through a lateral bloodline, Veyron's bloodline. Thresh had gone to Elder Holt. Holt had sealed the evidence. 3 weeks later, Holt was dead of a sudden illness that the royal physician certified without question. Thresh had been silent for 19 years. He slid a second document across the workbench, the amended succession clause in Veyron's own handwriting. "He doesn't want you dead," Thresh said, looking at Rowan. "A dead heir creates questions. An exiled, bondless heir creates legal precedent. Once you cross the Iron Mere border at dawn, your birthright dissolves permanently under kingdom law. That is the final step. That is what tonight is about. That is what 23 years of quarterly invoices were building toward." Rowan looked at both documents side by side. 23 years compressed into paper and ink and payment receipts filed without a single missed quarter. The room smelled of dried compounds and old wood, and the staleness of spaces that have kept secrets too long. He stood up. "We go to Veyron now." Lord Veyron did not panic. That was the most terrifying thing about him. Rowan walked into his chambers at 3 a.m. with 2 documents and an Omega Maid at his shoulder, and Veyron looked at both documents, set them on his desk, and sat down with the composure of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his head for 20 years. "Rowan's mother carried a secondary bloodline," Veyron said. His voice was the same smooth, ceremonial register he used in the Great Hall. "A nomadic wolf clan from the far northern territories. Scattered, forgotten by everyone except the people who understood what they carried." He folded his hands on the desk. "Among them, one in every generation was born with a bond frequency so powerful it could override pack hierarchy entirely. Not just claim a mate, rewrite allegiance, bend the submission instinct of every wolf within range, regardless of their own alpha blood. Not a king, something else. Something the historical record describes, without exception, as catastrophic." "You had no right," Rowan said. "I had every right," Veyron said simply. Your mother's bloodline destroyed 3 packs before it was diluted into silence. I was not going to let it destroy a 4th. I protected Ironmere. I protected your father. I protected the pack from a frequency that would have dismantled everything the Ashvale line built. He looked up. His eyes were completely calm. I would do it again. Here is something worth understanding about men like Veyran, and they exist in every pack, every court, every institution that has ever decided it knew better than the person it was managing. They are not driven by hatred. They are driven by certainty. The absolute, unshakable certainty that their judgment is correct and that the cost they are imposing on another human life is simply the necessary arithmetic of a larger protection. They sleep well. That is the most dangerous thing about them. They sleep perfectly well. Rowan's control cracked. Not outward, inward. The rage finding the suppressed frequency the way water finds a fracture. 23 years of it pressing against the compound in his blood that had kept it contained since birth. His eyes flickered. The air pressure in the room shifted. On the desk, the documents trembled without wind. Veyran reached for the signal device to call the guards. Sable stepped forward and put her hand on Rowan's arm. The flickering stopped. The pressure dropped instantly, not pushed down, not suppressed. Disanchored, steadied, the way a compass needle stops spinning when it finds north. Rowan looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Thresh stood in the doorway and went completely still. "What bloodline are you?" Thresh said quietly. Sable looked at him. "I don't know. I was placed here at 7. I never knew by whom." Thresh crossed to Veyran's bookshelf, pulled a registry volume, Northern Nomadic Clans, Historical Records. Found the page, read it once, set it down with the careful precision of a man handling something that has just confirmed his worst fear and his greatest hope simultaneously. The bond flux inhibitor has one documented vulnerability, Thresh said. One condition under which it fails. Contact with a natural frequency anchor from the same northern bloodline. A specific genetic countersignal that the compound cannot override. He looked at Sable, then at Rowan. Someone placed her in this palace deliberately. Someone who knew what she was. Someone who knew that eventually, proximity would do what nothing else could. Veyran looked at Sable for the first time with something that had not been there before. Fear. It was never supposed to activate, Veyran said. His voice had finally lost its evenness. You were never supposed to touch him. Sable looked at her hand on Rowan's arm. She did not remove it. The bond flux inhibitor had been running in Rowan's bloodstream for 23 years. It had been adjusted with the precision of a system designed to last indefinitely. But it had not been designed for this, for the counter-frequency making direct contact with the subject's skin. The compound began breaking down not all at once, but progressively. The way a dam breaks, first a crack, then a fracture, then everything the dam was holding, finding every weakness simultaneously. Rowan felt it the way you feel the first real breath after years of breathing shallow. Not the volcanic catastrophe Veyran had spent 23 years preventing. Not madness. Not the uncontrollable rewriting of allegiances that the historical record described. Something steadier, something that felt, in a way he had no precedent for, in a way that 23 years of bondlessness had left him entirely unprepared to process, like himself. His bond frequency is activated. It moved through Grey Veil. Keep the Way sound moves through water, not a wave. a vibration, reaching every wolf in the building simultaneously through the biological channel that had been silent since his birth. In the guard posts, wolves went still mid-conversation. In the warriors' quarters, men sat up in their beds without understanding why. In the great hall, a night patrol guard dropped to one knee on the stone floor and stared at his own hands. In his study, King Edric Asheville set down his glass. He sat without moving for a long time. His wolf, the most dominant alpha frequency in the Northern Territories for 30 years, had just registered something it had never registered from his son's direction. Not absence, presence. The specific, unmistakable biological signature of the Asheville bloodline at full frequency. He stood up and walked toward the eastern wing. Lord Varen was taken before the full court at dawn, with his own documentation as evidence. The amended succession clause is in his handwriting, the 23 years of quarterly invoices. The blood work report bearing his registry stamp and Rowan's birth weight in the clean, formal script of a physician who had sealed the truth under his floor and paid for it with his life. Varen did not deny it. He stood before 300 wolves and explained himself with the same composure he had maintained throughout, which was, in its own way, the most damning thing about him. A man who feels no remorse is not a man who made a mistake. He is a man who made a choice and has spent every year since confirming to himself that the choice was correct. That kind of certainty does not respond to consequences. It only responds to being stopped. So he was exiled to the far northern territories, the homeland of the bloodline he had spent 23 years trying to erase. The court noted the irony without speaking it aloud. The exile papers bearing Rowan's name were burned in the great hall fireplace. King Edric held them over the flame himself. He did not speak. Some things do not have words adequate to them, and the attempt to find words only diminishes the weight of the silence. 3 days later, Rowan lay in the recovery room while the royal physician managed the biological adjustment of 23 years of suppression releasing in a single night. It was not painless. The body does not absorb 23 years of being something other than itself without cost. There were hours on the second night when the outcome was not certain. Sable did not leave the room. She sat on the floor beside his bed with her back against the cold stone wall because there was no second chair, and she had not asked for one. Her presence regulated his frequency the way the compound never had, not by suppressing it, but by anchoring it. By being north, the compass needle was always pointing toward without knowing what it was pointing at. King Edric came on the second morning. He stood in the doorway for a long time looking at his son. Then he walked to the bedside table and set the Asheville heir seal on it. The seal that had sat in his desk drawer through 3 consecutive registry assessments and 1 exile processing that had come within hours of being completed, and walked out without speaking. Some fathers show love loudly, and others show it in the objects they leave on tables when they think no one is watching. Neither is better. Both leave marks. Rowan woke on the 3rd morning to gray light coming through the narrow window off the iron-gray lake. The frost month. The same light that had come through this window every morning of his life, flat and cold and indifferent, the way weather is always indifferent to the specific sorrows happening beneath it. Sable was asleep on the floor beside him, her back against the bed frame, her ink-stained hand open on the cold stone. Her breathing is slow and even. He looked at her for a long time. The bond frequency moved in his chest. Not wild, not the catastrophic force Varen had spent 23 years fearing. Steady, present, like a door that had been closed his entire life, standing quietly open onto a room that had always been there. He reached down carefully and placed his hand over hers on the cold stone floor. Her fingers closed around his without her waking. Her breathing didn't change. He stayed still and let himself feel it. The gray morning light, the sound of the lake against the keep's foundation. The Ashvale air seal on the table beside him. The warmth of her hand. The particular silence of a room where something wrong for a very long time has finally, at high cost, been set right. 23 years of quarterly invoices. 23 years of adjusted dosages. 23 years of a man's certainty imposed on another man's life. And in the end, what dismantled all of it was not a warrior, not a council, not a king. See, it was an Omega Maid with ink-stained fingers who carried a document for 43 days because she could not find the moment that was right, and then chose the moment that was last. They adjusted the dosage every quarter, filed the invoice, and watched him train alone in the frost, and told themselves it was necessary. They put the one person his blood would always recognize in the same building, and told her to be invisible, and hoped the math would never work itself out. Some frequencies find each other regardless of what stands between them. Some truths survive every attempt to bury them, because the person carrying them refuses to put them down. This was Rowan Ashvale, the bondless heir who was never bondless at all. Which moment hit you hardest? Varen's calm certainty. The 43 days Sable carried it alone. Oh, or Rowan's hand over hers at the end? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if this story found you at the right time, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next one is already written. You are not ready for it.